week and a half ago that, Ava and I, we're just a normal family, and we were having one of those, adult married conversations, if you will. And in the midst of that conversation, I fired my wife from her staff position, which was cool. That went over like a fart in a spacesuit. And but we started talking, and the next morning when we were all calm, cool, and collected, we talked more, and we agreed to that. And the reason is that my wife works really, really hard. She works 40 to 50 hours a week, but it is a hard 40 to 50 hours a week. And the summertime is her busy season as a real estate appraiser, and she was beginning to do work at 8 o'clock. She wakes up at 5. I am kind of her alarm clock at 5 a.m. I help wake her up. And so I know she wakes up at 5, and then she started doing work at 8, 9, 10 o'clock in the evening, well past my bedtime. And so what I saw was it wasn't fair to put that expectation on her. As a staff member here at Wellspring, she had to write certain emails each week, respond to certain emails. She had to read books, answer questions about books. There was a whole lot of extra things that were on her shoulders as a staff member of Wellspring, an unpaid staff member. And so I looked at our life and our priorities, and I simply said, out of love for her, you're fired. Because we need to reprioritize. You work really, really hard, and it's not fair for me to put those expectations on you. And so we're working through that, but I think what we're looking at today speaks into this. We're going to look at our value of simplicity. We have that catchy phrase, keep it simple, the end. Because if we really try to explain simplicity, that's kind of ironic, right? So keep it simple. But it plays right into our mission statement. Wellspring Church exists to ignite a craving for Jesus by relentlessly loving our community. People can walk into a church and see all these different programs and get lost in the chaos that is church. We want to keep our approach simple. Go into the community, love the community, ignite a craving for Jesus, and then complete the circle so that they then go into the community and love the community. Let's just keep it that stinking simple. Because as people have a craving for Jesus ignited up in them, they can come into a church and see all these different things, and all of a sudden that puts out the fire. Because they don't know where to go. They don't know what to do. And so we want simplicity to be in and through us to help us attack our mission statement. We're going to look at Luke chapter 10 today. So if you have your Bible, you can open up to Luke chapter 10. Matthew, Mark, Luke. If you hit John, you went too far. Or you can just go right into the app and it will pull it up right for you. Luke chapter 10, we're going to look at this story that is so relatable for you and I. I shared a little conversation that my wife and I were having, and we're going to look at a conversation happening within a household where two sisters start groveling, and they start complaining, and they start fighting. You have kids. I know that has never happened in your household. I know that as you guys drive to church, you're listening to Hillsong. You're listening to the worship Spotify playlist, singing Kumbaya in your cars. There is never any fighting in your home, so I understand there's a disconnect between this. But we're going to look at a family that had a little bit of a discussion. They're close friends with Jesus, and Jesus pops in and says this in verse 38. Now, as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village. A woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. She had a sister called Mary. And what did Mary do? Who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. So here's Mary sitting and listening to the teacher. Jesus is traveling around probably with his, going 12 deep with his disciples, perhaps even a little bit of a bigger crowd. He comes to this family, a family that we know from other passages. They're a close family. It's two sisters, a brother Lazarus. It's a very close family. And Jesus has this special relationship with them. And so he's traveling around, and Martha's like, come into my house. It's probably unannounced. She probably wasn't able to prepare for it. And it's not just Jesus. They are traveling around. There's a group of people that all of a sudden bombard whose house? Mary's. See, for Mary to be in that culture, in that day and age, for her to have her own house says a lot. Martha. For Martha to have her own house, it says a lot about Martha, doesn't it? That she has an income that can provide that she has purchased a house. Martha's probably your list person. She's that get-it-done type of person. She's that mom with a family that has that color-coded calendar, has the sticky notes all over the place, and the husband just needs to ask, where am I going? Tell me what I'm doing. Just spoon feed me, right? She's probably that type of person. She's that type A personality that is so structured, and it's worked out well for her. She's purchased her own house. She is the person of the house, the lady of the house, and so she probably goes into a panic by this unannounced visit. Her energetic personality takes over. All of a sudden, Jesus is in the house with his friends, and she loves Jesus, and now she's task, do, and we're going to see that in a second. She instantly is going to get to work, whereas Mary, her sister, you ever have two kids in the same household, and you're like, how are they so different? Mary's different. She's maybe energetic, but she's more of the attentive type. She's more that I'm going to go and I'm going to sit at the feet of Jesus. I'm a good listener. I'm a Martha, and so those people annoy me. But seriously. So Mary is at the feet of Jesus, and I'll make this side point. This isn't necessarily the main point of the text, but I love how throughout the Gospels, Jesus is never demeaning to women. He's never chauvinistic. The place at the feet of Jesus is meant for those of royalty, or meant for those of a distinguished nature. That's the closest relationship. And so Mary, a woman, goes to the feet of Jesus, and it's completely natural. I love the respect that Jesus shows to women, and whoever says Jesus did otherwise is a fool. So Mary goes to the feet of Jesus, and it's like these two personalities. Martha, that type A, that buy a house, that get it done type of person, and Mary, who's like, ooh, Jesus is here. I'm just going to have myself a seat. You do you, Martha. I had that growing up. My brother's very different than I am. I was talking to him a little bit this week, and I was reminded as we were talking about our days working construction. We were laborers on a big construction site, and so we had a broom in our hand at all times. And we were just the grunt. They had a curse word name for us, but we were that person that just did whatever we were told. And so my brother hated the job, but he loved the paycheck. And I am the type A, get it done type of person. So my broom was always working. When you sweep in a construction site, there's a lot of dirt. And so when you sweep, you push, you knock it off. You push, knock it, push. That's the proper way to sweep on a construction site. Otherwise, if you don't knock the sand out, you're just doing nothing. And so I worked really, really hard. And I would work, and I would get promoted. I would get more responsibility. My pay would never change, but I would get more responsibility, and I thought it was awesome. And my brother, on the other hand, who hated working, he found an attic that he could hear people walking up, found himself a nice little seat, sat there probably like this with the broom in his hand, and as soon as he heard somebody coming, and he was just sweeping away. He never got any more responsibility because he didn't want any more responsibility. And that was the cleanest attic in the whole stinking place because he spent his whole summer there. And when I was telling him this week that I was going to annihilate him in the sermon, because I give people the respect when I'm going to do that. I tell them, hey, I'm going to publicly make fun of you. It's whatever. And he was like, yeah, but we got the same paycheck. And I was like, you're such a jerk. You're absolutely right. We got the same paycheck. But that's, my brother and I, we battled throughout high school. I like to be on time. I like to say school starts at 7:30. I'm going to work my way back. Okay, I need to leave the house at 6:50 to be there on time. For me, on time is 5 to 10 minutes early. If you're there on time, then you cut it too close. And my brother was like, if school starts at 7:30, I can start eating my cereal at 7:25. I get 5 minutes grace, and then I can suck up to the teacher, so, yeah, I'm good. And the honking and the fighting that we had growing up in high school because we were so different came to a head. So Mary's house, or Martha's house, Mary has a simple focus. I want to be at the feet of Jesus. Martha, as we're going to see, has this different focus. She wants to do. And so it's a scene ripe with conflict, a scene ripe for confrontation. And for the Marthas in the room, the lists, the doers, if you will, don't we look at this and we look at Mary and we're like, yeah, I can get where Martha is going to have a beef. Mary frustrates me. She's annoying me before we even read the rest of the story. But if we take a step back, what is Mary doing that's so wrong? If we remove ourselves from thinking and seeing the scene, like being in the scene, wouldn't we look at Mary and say that's exactly where she needs to be? And that's the problem sometimes with Marthas. We don't take a step back to really view the situation as we should. So our text goes on like this. But Martha was what? Say it. Distracted with much serving. And she went up to him who said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me. Martha sees the situation unfolding. She acknowledges that Jesus is Lord, acknowledges his messiahship, and then bosses Jesus around. You see the disconnect, right? Martha is so busy at work. Leave this text up for a little bit. Martha is so busy with work. The text doesn't say, well, Martha was hard at work. It doesn't say, well, Martha was busy taking care of all of Jesus' needs. It says Martha was what? Distracted. Her focus was, there was a disconnect because why? With so much serving. And when we're distracted, the Marthas in their room, when we are all of this serving, all of this doing, all of that, I wake up at 5, I go to sleep at 10 or 11, and there's never a moment to pause. Is that perhaps the times when we, because we're not taking a step back, look at Jesus and say, Jesus, don't you care? Maybe it's because we're so distracted that it leads to a point of looking at Jesus and questioning everything about him. We know he's Lord, but in our distractions, we're going to boss him around. We're not going to be at the feet of Jesus. She's distracted. That in the Greek, you could also translate that. You could translate that as she was dragged away. Here's where I should be. But in my hard work, I'm being dragged away from where I should be. I'm dragged away from where I should be sitting. Her distraction has pulled her away from what is entirely where she should be because she's a perfectionist. She's looking at the situation. It's not like she's doing anything wrong. She's doing chores. She's helping out. That's good. Problem is, she probably cares too much. And so she goes to Jesus and she callously looks at him and talks to Mary, who's probably in earshot. I mean, she's at the feet of Jesus, and accuses him of callously disregarding her. You don't care about me. She expected Jesus to join her in looking at Mary and saying, Mary's lazy. Mary's good for nothing. She's selfish. The way that she words the question assumes that Jesus will join her in this escapade, join her in this mission to annihilate Mary for what she is doing, because ultimately she's probably jealous of Mary. She wants to be at the feet of Jesus. She looks at him and says, Lord. She loves the Lord. She's just showing it in a different manner. This passage, we map out our text and what we're talking about. We map it out. Well, actually, I just mapped out most of 2018, so I guess we do it a lot further in advance. So we had this mapped out a while ago, and it's so funny to me, not funny, but God's timing, that this passage, what we're talking about this week, just God used to rip me apart in all the right ways, to come before you and say, I'm a Martha. I'm terrible at this. It's easy for me to see a need, and all of a sudden by the end of the week, I put in 60 plus hours. That's not fair to my family. It can destroy my family. I've made a promise to Ava that we would plant a church, but I would never let it destroy our family because too many people start churches, and by the end of their life together, it rips the marriage apart or it rips the family apart. That I made a promise that I would do everything in my power not to let that happen. And here I am as a Martha, doing, and it just was, God took this text and just took a broom to my face. And as I was studying it, here's what happened for me this week, and this is where it came to a pinnacle. A friend from Bayside went to the Red Sox. They lost last night, so, it's whatever. I can still mention them. And they lost to the stupid Yankees. And they lost. So we went to a game this past Monday. I got free tickets, and he gave me 3 days notice. I was like, man, I had a sermon prep and okay, I'll do it. And so I took my boys, had 3 tickets, and they went up. My mom was visiting. They go with my mom. I traveled after a wedding and went up late that night. I ended up driving too late, had to get a hotel, and finish the trip in the next morning. And I had just worked two large weeks, and what I should have done is just taken Monday off and trusted that the world wasn't going to fall apart by me taking Monday off. But what I did instead was I got to my house in New Hampshire by 6 a.m. I started working on sermon prep. I had sermon prep done and still put in a full day's work on Monday. Went to the Red Sox game. They lost, but it was fun with the boys. And then we woke up early on Tuesday, and we drove back. And I'm listening to a book we have each staff member listening to certain books, and so I was listening to the book for me. And so I took 6 hours to listen to this audio book, because I don't read, I do the audio thing. And so I listened to this book, and when I got home, I thought to myself about what we were preaching, and I said, what a stinking waste, you jerk, Jason. You made your kids listen to an audiobook for 6 hours in the car because you were working. And what conversation did you have with Landon? Did you talk to Brady about his upcoming birthday? I was so busy doing for what? And I was so angry at myself when I got back in the driveway. Because my priorities were so messed up. And that's what happens when we get distracted. Our priorities get all sorts of out of whack. So our passage goes on. The Lord responds. But the Lord answered her, Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things. But one thing is what? Necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her. Jesus looks at her, and he knows her name really, really well. Martha, Martha, which is a sign of you better hear what I'm about to say. Take it very seriously. Martha, Martha, you would think it's a good thing, but it's like you. A lot of you call me Pastor Jason. That's cool. It's a sign of respect. I get that. You can call me whatever you want. I'm just a dude like you guys, but I get that. But you call me Pastor Jason. Here, it's completely cool and whatnot. But when Ava or Landon or Brady says, oh, there's Pastor Jason, that's rarely a compliment in that setting. Martha, Martha. You're what? You're anxious. You're troubled. She expected Jesus to look at her and say, Jesus, you're gonna give it to Mary. Mary's going to get it. But instead, the table has turned. It has backfired. Martha isn't really struggling with disappointment. She's not, or even really disapproval. She's just lacking in her do personality. She lacks compassion. And it comes across in anxiety and worry. Martha, I see that you care, but perhaps you care too much. Your focus, your priorities are all out of whack. Everyone in the room should be with Jesus instead of joining Martha. Mary isn't concerned with the trivial. She's not concerned with all the tasks. She just sees Jesus, the Lord, is in my presence, and that's where I ought to be. See, we are citizens of the King, and we can be hard working for the King, obeying the King. But we don't do that to become a citizen. We do that because we just love Jesus and we want to do for him. But as we're doing, can't we sometimes get to the point where we're actually neglecting the King that we're working for? And Martha has now done that. She's ignoring Jesus, who is in her very house. And Jesus looks at Mary and just says simply, well, Mary chose what's better. She wasn't getting caught up in all those things. The work that you're doing is good, but is it the most important thing? Martha, is what you're doing, is it necessary? Think about that word. Everything that you're tied up in, Martha, is it necessary? Because I'm looking at Mary, and I'm looking at what she's doing and where she's at and hearing me and what I'm saying, and I'm looking at Mary, and I would describe it as, that's necessary. What you're doing is, at this point, trivial. She's chosen what is necessary. On the count of three, do me a favor. Let's read what Mary says in the text. 1, 2, 3. She said nothing, right? Mary in this whole thing, we've read the whole passage. Mary has said nothing. You know what that means? That means we know what's important to Mary without her ever saying a word. We know Mary's priorities because Mary lives them out. She chooses to do what is better. Her actions has spoken her beliefs, her priorities. And so for you and I, what would, if someone examined our lives, what would be true of our priorities? For Mary, Jesus is the priority. We know that. So for Mary, she understands some activities can wait. There's a time to do. There's a time to help. There's a time to serve. But are we working and serving and neglecting God's word? Are we working and serving and neglecting prayer? Are we working and serving, or are we so busy with family? Are we so busy with all these other things that by the end of the day we look back and we say, what did I give to Jesus? I've neglected my first priority. I've neglected what is necessary. See, a disciple needs to understand what he or she ought to be doing, but not to the point of neglecting the King. Martha's problem at the end of the day becomes this. In her doing nature, catch this, she's wicked concerned with somebody else. Isn't that sometimes the problems with Martha's, like the doers, the list, and all of a sudden they're the ones doing, they're the ones just keep going, I'm going, and my stupid brother's up there, that jerk, he's over there. We get so caught up in our tasks, we're neglecting Jesus, and all of a sudden in our doing, we start looking at other people and saying, what are you doing? We start criticizing. We start getting jealous. We start hating the people around us because they're not joining us, when we can look at the Marys at the feet of Jesus and say, well done. That's where we should be. We become so critical. I want to lead a church that doesn't look around criticizing people. I want to lead a church that instead of putting all the efforts into criticizing others, that we would put that effort in saying, I'm going to look at myself and get myself right. Sometimes we have the misplaced focused. Check out this video from Colleen Curcio.
Hi, I'm Colleen, and I am a volunteer at Wellspring, and I was asked to speak to you about the simplicity of faith. And I can tell you from my personal experience, I always thought that I can be fulfilled or satisfied by maybe getting a new job or getting more money or getting an approval from somebody or having someone pat me on my back and say, good job. And maybe sometimes if I got any of those things, I did get fulfilled or satisfied, but it was very temporary and it was short-lived. So I was constantly on a hamster wheel trying to get the next fulfillment or the next satisfaction, and they would never come. So I really had to focus on my life of what was missing. And what I found, what was missing from the equation was God and my relationship to God and where I put him in my life. So I needed to focus on what was missing from my life, and I realized that it was my relationship with God. And what I did to build my relationship with him was join a church, and I chose Wellspring. And what I did was not only be a parishioner, but I also wanted to volunteer. So I volunteer in multiple areas of Wellspring. I've joined a life group with my family, and that is very important for building your relationship with God as well. It's a good fellowship time. I highly recommend it. Donating, but not only just donating supplies like diapers or cleaning supplies, it's also donating your time, like Relentless Love Week that we did to go out into the community, tithe and offering. So many of those things are helping me strengthen my relationship with God. And I'm finding more and more each day that his desires are now becoming my desires, and his wants are now becoming my wants. And I see myself slowly being fulfilled in a different way and being satisfied in a different way. Now that I am making my relationship with God a priority and following his will, everything is just naturally falling into place. Now, I'm not saying that every day is perfect. I struggle with this every day, and I have to remind myself every day. My relationship with God has to be priority. And one good reminder for me is Matthew 6, verse 33. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all things will be given to you as well.
I love Colleen. She serves in multiple areas, and last week we had to say, you're too busy, and why don't you step out of this ministry to focus on this ministry, because we weren't being fair to you either. She's a mom of 2, and so she's learning to simplify life. And what she said throughout that whole video, and she kept using this word, which was just so cool how God put this together, was she kept using the word priority, priority, priority. And I think as we look at the story of Mary and Martha, that I think we can draw this conclusion. Simplicity is a matter of priorities. That as we look to simplify our lives, as we look to be at the feet of Jesus, it is clear Mary has made Jesus a priority. And so our simplicity, living a more simplified life, is a matter of priorities. That's why we're going through a whole series on our mission and our core values. Because for us, as we developed this, we were developing a church, and we were saying, well, you know what, here's what's true. We could have a whole bunch of core values. We could have a whole, we want to take a simplistic approach, but here's why. Because we can be okay at a bunch of things, or we can choose to be great at a small handful of things. We'd rather be great at a handful of things than okay at a bunch of things. Because if everything's important, nothing is important. And so for us, I want to be the church in Toms River that free kicks butt at loving the community. I want to love the crud out of the community. And we're going to excel at that. And it's important to us. It's more than just a Relentless Love Week. We are going to give that everything we have, and we're going to love our people, and there's things that we're doing within the church to love our people, and we're going to be a church that does life groups and has that be sermon series, so it's easy for people to get to connect, and they don't have to feel like they have to know everything about the Bible. They just have to listen to the sermon and answer a few questions about the sermon. We're going to keep it simple, because if everything is important, then nothing is important, and what comes our way, the staff's way, my way, is all these things. Well, this church did this, or this church did that, and that's great. I'm so glad that those churches excel at all those things, but we can't say yes to that ministry or to that program, because, again, if we do all of the programs, all of the ministries, then we're going to be okay at them. I want to be excellent, because I want our mission and our values to help us really say no to things. When our serving becomes so elevated that we're neglecting Jesus, and perhaps is the time where service is self-serving. Jesus never looks at Mary and says the actual work that you're doing is misplaced, or the actual work that you're doing is wrong. He looks at it and says, you're simply too busy. Your gift as a get-it-done type of person has become your undoing. I'm that type of person. A deadline is a deadline. Punctuality is a virtue. If there's an issue before me, if there's something that needs to be swept, I want to sweep as quick as I can, get it done ASAP, and sometimes that becomes my undoing. Sometimes that type of personality, I lose track of things, and all of a sudden it's neglecting my family or neglecting Jesus. And you know what I need? I need friends to tell me, Jason, you're being critical. Jason, you're being a jerk. Jason, when that happens, you're probably burnt out. You need to take a rest. And so who are the friends in your life saying, I see your personality. I see it's a strength, but right now, it's your undoing. Right now, you need to either take a step back or take a step forward. Who are the friends that would speak into our lives like the Lord is speaking into Martha's life and saying, no, I love you. This isn't okay. Perhaps we need to listen to them instead of ignoring them. Perhaps Mary could have provided Martha some great advice. I want to teach you a word. One word. And if you ever hang out with my 2-year-old daughter, you will know it really, 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 really well in a matter of no. We need to be a people that learn to say no. Simply say no. Because when we say yes to something, by default, we have to say no to something else. If we're saying yes and yes and yes and yes, as I say yes and yes and yes to ministry, then I'm saying no and no and no to my family. As I'm saying yes and yes and yes, I'm saying no. You see what we're doing here? Sometimes we have to say no to free up time with Jesus. If we say no, it helps us to be at the feet of Jesus. And so Mary says nothing in the whole passage. She says nothing. But we know her priorities because we see her actions. We know that Jesus is so important to her because she's at the feet of Jesus. We know Jesus is a priority, not because of what she said. We would all say Jesus is important. We would all say Jesus is a priority. But Mary never says that. We look at her life and we say, I know Jesus is a priority. And so for us, my challenge is, okay, beyond words, what does our schedule say? Think about the last 7 days of your life since last Sunday. What would your schedule communicate as a priority to you? You have a phone like I have a phone. Pull up your Bank of America app. Pull up your Chase app. Pull up your TD Bank app. Look at everything you spent your money on in the last week. What would it communicate about your priorities? What would it communicate about what is important to you? Mary doesn't have to say a word. Her actions declare what is a priority, what is important to her. And so my challenge for us, if we're going to live a simplified life, and that's going to be dictated by our priorities, and my challenge is this: make a mission statement with 5 values. Make a mission statement for yourself, for your household, for your family, whatever the context of family that you find yourself in. Make a mission statement. Have 5 values that flow from your mission statement, and then do this. Set a schedule and a budget accordingly. Maybe this whole talk for us today is a time to reevaluate. Maybe it's a time to say, yeah, life is out of whack. Life is busy. Life is crazy. And so, yeah, I'm going to write a mission statement. I'm going to have 5 values, 5 priorities. I'm going to reset my schedule based on my priorities, not let my schedule dictate my priorities, but I'm going to set my priorities and then dictate my schedule and my budget accordingly, and then have the freedom to quit something, not just to quit it, but to say yes to Jesus. To free up time with Jesus. 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 There's a passage in Psalms that says this: the one who offers thanksgiving as his sacrifice glorifies me. To the one who orders his life rightly, I will show the salvation of God. When we're busy doing, the Martha's in the room, and I struggle with this, I find myself being unthankful. I find myself with a lack of thankfulness in me because I'm doing. And I think sometimes when we don't order our lives rightly, we neglect thanksgiving. And when we don't order ourselves rightly, when we don't have structure to our lives according to our priorities, then we lose sight of Jesus. In an ordered life, I will show myself. Are we not seeing God because we are so busy? And isn't that the attack from the evil one? To get us so busy, sometimes with good things, but to get us so busy that we don't need Jesus, or Jesus isn't that important. We're so busy, I don't have time for Jesus. God says, order your life, set your priorities, and I will show myself in the midst of that. And so we go back to our big thought for the morning. Simplicity is a matter, or priorities, what is it? Simplicity is a matter of priorities. It was different down there. We're going to take time to look over and contemplate over communion. What I'm going to do, though, before we take communion is I want to give us 2 minutes, 2 solid minutes. I'm actually going to set a timer. I want us to take 2 minutes of just silence. Because my conviction, as God was working through this passage with me this week, and I would have to echo this sentiment outside of what we did Thursday night, is that I don't just take 2 minutes of just silence before God. And so I'm going to ask that before we move forward, before we take time of communion, before we reflect on what God has done for you and I, before we give thanks for what God has done, before we remember the sacrifice that He has made for you and I, wouldn't we honor God, maybe in light of this sermon, just to take 2 full minutes of just pausing and letting Him speak in the midst of just chilling out? Because if you're like me, this might be the only time all week that you have 2 minutes of just peace. Your children are in nursery. Your children are in the child care. They're not running around asking for sippy cups. The college paper, the syllabus coming up, the going back to school, it can wait. Right now, we can sit in this moment before God. So let's take. For some of us, that was the longest 2 minutes of our lives. And I have to admit, one of the things I said is, Lord, forgive me. Because as I'm sitting there, my mind is going, well, I got to remove this table. I got the worship team. My mind instantly went to things to start doing. And you idiot! Like, you just told him take 2 minutes to focus on and I was literally thinking about getting all of this off the stage. Man, what a benefit just to take a few minutes of silence and say, God, I don't want to do. I just want to be. I just want to be. I just want to be your child. So we're going to take a moment now to reflect over communion. And so you guys had these passed out to you on your way in. If you didn't get one, an aisle host can get you one. We're gonna pray here in a second. There's 2 flaps. The top flap is for the wafer. The bottom flap is for the juice. When we're done, I will probably just walk off the stage, but the aisle host will be passing out empty buckets that you can place your trash in there, because the school doesn't like communion cups laying around. Silly them. So we'll pass out some buckets to collect that at the end. But we do this because Jesus told us to. There's nothing magical about it. It's just a time to remember what Jesus did for us. It's a time for Christians to look at these elements and reflect upon Christ's body being broken, Christ's blood being shed. And so if you're a parent and you have your children in the room, we trust you to know if your child has committed their lives to Jesus and if it's appropriate for them to take communion with us. But here's why let me first give thanks. God, thank you for a time to reflect. Thank you for a time to pause. Thank you for a time to simply order our lives of sorts and to come into this moment thankful for what you've done, remembering the sacrifice and in doing so with gratitude, Father. In your name, amen. So Paul writes about this in 1 Corinthians, and he talks about how on the night the Lord Jesus was betrayed, he took bread, he gave thanks for it, he broke it, and he gave it to his disciples. And he told them to do this as often as they meet together, to remember how his body was and will be broken for them. So in remembering the Lord's brokenness for us, let's take this bread together. In the same way, Paul goes on, he says that the Lord asked that they take the cup, and that as they do so, that they would remember that the Lord's body was not only broken, but he shed blood for them. So let's take the cup together. And then he says, as often as you do it, you get the opportunity, the joy, the privilege to proclaim the Lord's death until he comes back. Because our God is not a dead God, he's a living God. Google right now Jesus' grave. You'll never find it. He's not there. So our God is alive and he's coming back. And we get to celebrate that.